It's not often on this channel that I'll actively decide to finish a series, because a lot of the time there's just not that much point, especially with the more lore-focused episodes. If I'm just explaining the background and history of different creatures existing in a universe, there's not really a progressing storyline, so I don't need to write a big finale. But the FNAF Dragons episodes are a little bit different. I wrote them with one progressing storyline, as a weird mix of FNAF lore and lore from my own original Dragon universe, where all the episodes are narrated by Ther the Beast Chronicler. And this is a series that I think does actually deserve a proper ending. The last time I did an episode in this series, FNAF Security Breach animatronics as dragons, the game wasn't actually out yet, so I had to use speculation about what was going to happen to inspire the story. Now, the game has actually been out for a while, and I can use actual plot points from the game to inspire how this series ends. I am taking a lot of creative liberties still, but fair warning, there are spoilers in this if you haven't gone through all of the different endings of the game. But with all that out of the way, it's time to finish up the FNAF Dragon series. Let's go! Hit like if you want, subscribe if you feel like, but either way, enjoy the show. I lay on the ground, panting and confused, with so many more questions than I'd ever had before about the Phasbian Kingdom. What had happened to Henrik Emil and Michelangelo Afterian? Not to mention all the citizens who'd fled the original island kingdom for safety from the king's creatures. Who was making these new creatures? Was the vile sorcerer king Willis Afterian back in human form once more? And the overarching question that had remained as always, if there were souls of devoured children trapped inside these creatures, how could I set them free? I'd just barely escaped New Phasbia with a small boy who'd been trapped there and the ground's only guard, Vanessa. I'd managed to open a portal back to the nexus point of my world, very close to my village. After picking myself up, I suggested we all head there, but soon noticed the boy, who I eventually learned was named Gregor, was anxiously eyeing Vanessa and backing away from her. When I asked him why, the boy said, He told me not to trust her. I asked who, but just as I did, I noticed for the third time that eve, a small white rabbit hopping along behind Vanessa. For the first time, I stared at it closely and noticed it was somewhat transparent. I could faintly make out the grass behind it as it hopped right behind Vanessa, who looked at the two of us confused. Before she could say anything, the ephemeral rabbit leapt right into Vanessa's body, and she instantly started to shake. Her mouth foamed with blood, and her eyes went red. Her mouth peeled back into an eerie grin, and she said, "Leaving so soon, Gregor? But the king will see you now." Her skin suddenly shifted into a bizarre sewn material as she grew 30 feet, her arms stretching into wings and a tail with a blade at its tip spewing from her back. Her head shifted into the shape of a white, rabbit-like dragon, not wholly unlike the rabbit dragon Michelangelo Afterian had described his late father of possessing. My hand shot down to my blade, but before it was even half drawn, the tattered dragon slammed its head against me and flung me aside. It grabbed Gregor in its massive paw and shot off into the air, right back in the direction of New Phasbia. A jolt of shame at my failure to protect the boy fired through me. Despite being the overseer of my world, imbued with the power to help protect it and its people, I still hadn't figured out how to properly teleport anywhere else in my world other than the nexus point. I needed another way to follow after them. As I sprinted towards my village, I swore to myself, I've had it. This all ends tonight. I took about 10 minutes to get home, where my fateful dragon ally, Violet, rested, finishing recovery from an injury she'd acquired in the Skylands. I bolted into my home, tossed my blade aside, and tore off the wall instead a massive buster blade, forged from the crest spikes of a soaring Saigon. I ran back to Violet, leapt on her back, and we shot off after Vanessa and Gregor, praying we weren't too late to save them. Even with Violet's short-range teleportation abilities, it still took us 2 hours to reach the shoreline kingdom of New Phasbia, and we certainly didn't appear to a peaceful scene, though it wasn't what I could have expected. Gregor was nowhere in sight. Vanessa was clearly visible, swirling through the air above the castle in her dragon form, tearing her claws into another dragon. It had a bear-like head, orange and blue striped skin, and most oddly of all, a top hat. From above, I could see other dragons scouring the grounds, possibly searching for Gregor. Oddly enough, I hoped that was the case. It at least meant he hadn't already been devoured or elsewise killed. The rabbit-like dragon Vanessa had become slashed its bladed tail against the bear dragon, who mostly seemed to just be defending itself. But then Vanessa tried to soar down towards one of the Central Kingdom towers, and the other dragon swooped in front of her, blocking her path. She shrieked and chomped into the bear dragon's neck. I was tempted to aid the bear dragon, but I didn't know if I should be killing Vanessa. She may have only been possessed and not in control of herself. As my mind raced to decide, I noticed a white, horrific-looking spider-like drake darting into the castle halls that Vanessa had just tried to fly towards. It must have been where Gregor was. Violet lowered me down and I leapt off. I asked her to help keep any other creatures from entering, and I sprinted in after the spider drake with my Sciagon blade drawn. It glowed yellow, lighting my way, but the creature still managed to escape my sight as the halls split and parted in all directions. There was no time for subtlety. I called out, telling Gregor I'd find him and that a creature was coming. Then, suddenly, the pattering of draconic footsteps that had been echoing through the halls ceased. The creature must have heard me. I just hoped Gregor did as well. I continued running through the halls and eventually came to a wide-open, torchlit chamber. Inside were rows of tables being cleaned off by what at first I thought were humans, but upon closer inspection were only pale, soulless, human-like husks shambling around, tidying the room. My mind didn't have space for more questions, so I ignored the sight and ran through the room to keep looking, when a hand suddenly shot out from under the table ahead. My heart thumped and I swung my blade towards it instinctively, but quickly stopped myself. I skidded to a halt and dove to the ground to look under and see Gregor. I pulled him out, set my sword on the table, and immediately started tapping the runes on my forearm to open a portal. But as soon as I started, the closest pale creature grabbed my arm and started trying to yank me aside. I quickly tore my arm free to start over, but another creature grabbed my other arm and started shaking it. All the pale creatures began lumbering towards me. I shoved them back and reached for my blade, but one pushed it across the table to the ground, clattering against the stone. Soon there were a dozen of these creatures on me, tugging at my limbs and pawing their withered hands at my face. "Gregor, the sword!" I called to him through the mess of creatures. He slid back under the table, but just as he grabbed the blade, a high-pitched, monstrous shriek bellowed through the halls. The whole room shook as a large white fist smashed through one of the walls. Claws and hands tore open a hole in the wall, and through it crawled the spider drake, with purple flames spewing from its maw. I tried to tackle aside the ghastly horde around me and tear my arms free, but it was no use. The drake tossed tables aside as it crept towards Gregor, who could barely lift my blade. The creature walked right up to him, its head inches from his face as it grinned eerily at him and reached its hands down. Gregor used all his strength to swing the blade, but it barely scratched the creature's arm. The beast let out a low shriek, then batted the blade out of his hands. It grabbed Gregor, then crawled back through the hole in which it came. All I could do was watch him be carried away by the beast as I tried to free myself from the grip of the pale creatures. The last thing I heard Gregor yell was, "Get Michelangelo!" Eventually, I took a deep, agitated breath and shoved the creatures enough to lunge over a table away from them. They shambled after me, but I ran over to my sword and grabbed it. I ran right back at them, and with a single spinning swing, I sliced the lot of them in half. Their torsos flopped to the ground, but they kept trying to paw their way towards me. I kicked one aside, then ran after Gregor. "Get Michelangelo?" I repeated to myself. King Aftirian's son? The one who'd overthrown him originally? Was he imprisoned here? I chased after the scuttering footsteps and eventually burst into a clearing. The spider creature was ahead, holding Gregor above him with one hand and digging rapidly into the earth with its others. I ran faster and faster, raising my blade and channeling all my energy into it. The yellow light glowed brighter. The creature noticed my approach and swung its tail. I swung back and sliced the tail clean off with a single stroke. It squealed and dropped Gregor into the hole it had started digging. It spun around and thrust its arm at me next. I swung my blade, slicing its hand clean off. It shrieked again, but turned back to Gregor, who was trying to scramble out of the hole. The creature thrust its remaining limbs up, then slammed them down into the hole around Gregor. There was a dull thud as the earth caved in around the boy. Along with a cascade of dirt, he fell into an open chamber and right through a massive, glowing, eerie green portal below. I scrambled onto the spider drake's back and shoved my blade right through its skull. The creature let out a last fading cry as it slumped to the ground. But not a moment later, Vanessa shot across the sky over the hole and dove down into the portal below. I whipped around to see the bear dragon she'd battled landing down behind me and roaring into the portal after her. The purple wolf dragon from earlier that eve turned a corner and ran towards us, but the bear dragon whipped its body around and slammed its tail into the creature, sending it right into a wall. Why was this dragon battling the others? It looked like another of Aftirian's creations. Was there a good soul inside it, somehow controlling it? Then finally, a thought crossed my mind. On a whim, I looked up at it and said, "Michelangelo?" It immediately whipped its head around and looked down at me with its eyes wide. I said the name again, but the creature just continued to stare. Maybe I was right, or maybe not, but either way we still had to move. "Can we still save Gregor?" I asked it, completely unsure of how it could reply. It immediately grabbed me in its paw, leapt into the air, and lunged down into the portal. Just before passing through, I whistled as loud as I could. I hoped it worked. We came out the other side, and it was dark. Only lit by the glow of my blade and the dim light of the portal, I could see we were in a dungeon. It was full of smashed vials and spilling liquid and stacks of tattered books on sorcery. Up ahead was Vanessa in her dragon form, with Gregor wrapped in her tail as she was sliding open a massive cage with her paw. Through her maw rumbled the words,
"I've brought him, Master, the final soul. Come back to me."
As the screeching of the cage door halted, a silence fell over the dungeon. Then, a gargling roar like a demonic chuckle bellowed out as a decaying claw stomped forth. Lumbering into the dim light was the burnt and decaying body of the once golden rabbit dragon, long thought to have contained the tyrannical soul of King William Afton. The king's husk of a dragon snatched Gregor and smacked Vanessa aside. It seemed to grin at the child, though through its decaying skull head, it was hard to tell. I turned to the bear dragon and yelled, "Toss me!" Immediately, the creature hurled me with incredible might towards Aftirian. It noticed me too late and I skewered its already muscle-exposed shoulder. It barely reacted though, just angrily turning its head towards me, then lunging its teeth. Instinctively, stupidly, I leapt away, leaving the blade in place. Just as I landed, the dragon struck me with its paw, sending me soaring across the room, slamming through a table. It hurt, but adrenaline allowed me to leap up fast. The bear dragon let out a bellowing, furious roar that shook the dungeon as it stomped towards Aftirian. The demonic dragon chuckled, then shot straight up, smashing through the ceiling above. The bear dragon soared after him. I leapt onto its tail as it swooped up and out of the dungeon. I crawled my way up its tail onto its back, finally getting a look at our surroundings and realizing I was back at a place I had long dreaded returning to, the original island home of the Phasbian Kingdom. The castle was crumbling, the trees were withering, and all around were decaying monstrous dragons Aftirian had created, many of which had the souls of poor, terrified children likely trapped within them. They were horrific to behold, but a firm reminder of why this had to end. Aftirian swooped through the air and flew back down towards us, still holding Gregor in its paw. It drove its teeth right into the bear dragon's neck and sent us crashing towards the earth. I leapt from my mount on the bear dragon towards the beast's shoulder to grab my blade, but it swatted me with its wing and smacked me off course. I fell towards the ground, spinning out of control. I started tapping my arm, but knew I didn't have time to make a portal. I was mere feet from the ground when suddenly Violet sprung out of the dungeon and snatched me from the air. Thankfully, she'd heard my whistle. As we flew up, Aftirian slammed his foe down into the dirt. The bear dragon, through its pain, tried to reach for Gregor, but the monster raised the boy away and bit into the bear dragon's arm, nearly tearing it off. Gregor was shaking and horrified, but Aftirian had raised him right next to my blade, still stuck in its shoulder. Gregor quickly noticed, and through his fear, he grabbed the blade and yanked it out. Quickly, he raised it above his head, letting out a nervous battle cry. The blade shone from yellow to pink, and he slashed it right through the creature's arm, cutting it clean off, dropping Gregor to the ground. The dragon shrieked angrily and snapped his jaws towards the boy, but the bear dragon slammed its head forward, blocking the strike. Afterian furiously flew up above the castle, shrieking a menacing roar that rang across the island. Close by, I could still see some of the dragons, a pink fox-like creature and a withering golden bird dragon that had attacked me on my last visit. Both were cowering at the sound of Afterian's cry. It was the only time I'd seen fear from these creatures, and as terrified as I was of them, I sprinted towards the bird dragon and stood before it. My heart thudded as I yelled, "Don't fear him! Don't you see he can be beaten? Together you're stronger than he is!" The creature started lowering its head towards me, and I desperately wanted to back away, but didn't. It soon turned its head up to Afterian again above. It then turned to another creature who was now looking at the cruel king. Soon, a beast in the distance flew up into the air and started soaring towards Afterian. Then another, and another. The two creatures near me followed suit, along with Violet, and soon the bear dragon was airborne again and joining them. They surrounded the vile king in the air, and he swirled around, shrieking and snapping his jaws. None backed down. They all at once, in a unified horde, shot towards Afterian and began to tear his already decaying body apart. As blood and limbs sprayed overhead, I had to look away as I ran back over to Gregor. He too averted his eyes until the shrieking sounds above stopped, and instead a golden light shone down on us. Where Afterian's dragon had once been, now only remained a golden orb of light that slowly faded away. Seconds later, the menacing bird dragon dropped to the ground. Another golden light emerged from its body, then soon after, vanished as well. The same happened to another creature, then another and another. I knew what this had to be. These golden lights were the souls, finally being freed after being prisoners for so long in these creatures. The final one to drop was the bear dragon. As the golden light emerged from it, a faint voice could be heard with the words ringing around us, "Thank you." As light of day started to crest over the mountains, I finally allowed it to sink in that the nightmare was over. Soon after, we found Vanessa back in her human form, also freed from the possession placed on her by a minion of Afterian. I still had unanswered questions that maybe I'd never know the answer to, but at least the vile king's reign was over. All were freed, and nobody would ever again have to die at the jaws of a creature from what was once the Phasbian kingdom. As usual with Dragon episodes, all of the art from this episode is up as posters on my Teespring store. Should be linked in the little bar beneath this video or in the pinned comment, or both. But anyway, I finally finished the series. I mean, I guess I didn't really answer all of the questions people might have, like what happened to the people from the Kingdom of Emil, or how did Michelangelo get inside the Glamrock Freddy dragon, or how did Gregor know that Michelangelo was in the Glamrock Freddy dragon. But to anyone asking those questions, all I gotta say is, what are you, the story police? Because legally you have to tell me if you're the story police. I don't know why that became a recurring joke on this channel, but I'm gonna keep using it. Anyway, just because this is the end of the FNAF Dragons episodes doesn't mean it's the end of the FNAF episodes, or Dragon episodes, just the end of the two together. I've gotten lots of suggestions to do a FNAF Superheroes episode, but the one I'm most likely to do next is FNAF Mech Armours, because I really dig that idea. But anyway, if you are new to this channel and you haven't seen the previous episodes in this series, I've got 2 other FNAF Dragons episodes. Or if you want to know more about Tayrin and his whole dragon universe, maybe check out the Beast Chronicler episode. But besides that, that's all for today, except of course for ending this video on some kind of positive or uplifting note. And the thought I want to leave people with today is a nice simple one again. Quote I heard earlier this week, which is that you can't start the next chapter of your life if you keep rereading the last chapter. I think that one speaks for itself. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. I love you all, and I'll see you all in the next episode on Monday, which is finally a return to weird Marvel and DC fusions.